I did not come into the world cynical about journalists and about media. I've always loved the line by Will Rogers, or about Will Rogers, that Will Rogers never met a man he didn't like. And his son said that people misinterpret that people often interpret that to mean that he liked everybody. But the key word is met. And the point is that when he would meet people, he would like them, and they had to earn his dislike. And I like that a lot. And when I was 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, the press as a whole earned my dislike. And they did this by, it seemed, every time they wrote about something that I knew, it was inaccurate. And so this made me think, gosh, if every time I know something, they're wrong, how often are they wrong on things that I don't know anything about? And then as I became, and I wasn't even particularly politicized, it was just simple factual errors, that if I happen to know something about some issue, they were wrong. And then in my mid to late 20s, living in the inland Northwest, North Idaho, during the timber wars, the journalists kept presenting it as jobs versus owls, even though everybody, even the timber people in the region, knew that more jobs, that the cut was going up and jobs were going down because of raw log exports and automation. But nobody talked about that. It was always jobs versus owls every single time. And that's just a lie. I mean, the problem was raw log exports and automation. Of course, the problem is the wage economy and industrial logging in the first place, but of course they never talk about that. So I learned to have a healthy disrespect for the press. And then let's fast forward to 1992, 1993, when I'm having a conversation with my friend John Keeble, who, which the conversation ended up in my book, Listening to the Land. And we were talking about the Exxon Valdez oil spill and about the media coverage of it. And he said a couple lines in there that have always stuck with me. And remember, he was writing this in 1992, before the internet was really a thing. And it's so much worse now than it was then. And the lines I want to read, I'm going to take stuff from a couple different pages and sort of skip back and forth. In some ways, particularly as it applies to information, our society is totalitarian. There is, as Milan Kundera says, a lightness of being. The flag, Willie Horton, Perot's country twang, those symbols are all very lightweight. And then those are topical, of course. I would hope readers would think about how to address the problem of information and how they can conduct their lives in ways that will be effective. When I was researching out of the channel, I traveled between Alaska and my home outside Spokane. As a result, I would see what the media was covering up there, then come home and see the results of their coverage. Frequently, there seemed to be very little connection between what I had seen and what was being presented on TV. The print journalists were in general more accurate. The network TV presence in Alaska was abrasive, aggressive, and destructive, shining their lights on dying otters and the like. Then I came down here and saw the sound bites, which were so fragmentary in their presentation that they were untrue. That's more of Kundera's unbearable lightness. We have to hope that the thinness of information that people receive, that the thinness of entertainment that people indulge themselves in, the thinness of so much of our so-called literature, and the superficialities of human relations will take us to the point of exhaustion, and that we will then turn to something else. There's a relationship between capitalism of the sort we've developed and the way in which information is handled. It's exploitative, particularly when there are capitalist institutions with tremendous power. Any information that comes under their purview is going to have a spin to it. It swerves lightly in the air. In the publishing industry, there are now a very small number of very large companies. When we get to the point where the industrial and economic monoliths have either direct or indirect control over information, then our society will have locked up. Maybe the information superhighway will finish that job off for us. It may be a good thing when the superhighway arrives and the 500 channels complete the parody of diversity, because our seriousness needs to be called into being. In the same way that it took an environmental catastrophe to bring the Alaskan people outside of themselves, it may take a catastrophe of the word to do the same for those of us who care about language. So I think that's beautifully put. And I think things are infinitely worse than when John Keeble wrote that or said that to me in 1992. I think about that probably once a week. The parody of diversity. When I see, it doesn't matter how many websites you go to, you are going to get basically two versions of the truth. You're going to get the far right version and you're going to get the left version. You're going to get the woke version for the left. You're going to get the whatever it is for the right. And I think of that song from the 60s. How's the line go about basically everybody's holding up signs and most say hooray for our side? And I'm just horrified that right now there's a war going on between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And can MSNBC be bothered to cover this? Can CNN be bothered to cover it? Can Fox News be bothered to cover it? No, all they're doing is holding up signs saying hooray for our side. And I remember interviewing Bob McChesney, media critic, back in the late 90s. And even then, he was talking about how increasingly journalists were simply releasing press releases, that some company puts out a press release, they change a couple words, pop it out. And again, this has gotten increasingly worse. This is what we have with the internet is a simulation of diversity, all of them parroting the same fundamental message. There's a few people who will go with a different message, and then they get kicked off Twitter or banned from Facebook or have PayPal cut their funding, getting demonetized. And also what John Keeble said about a small number of publishers, I think most people would be delighted, most writers would be delighted if there were still the same number of publishers as there used to be, but it's gotten infinitely worse. Or heck, we'd be happy if there were still bookstores. But now Amazon sells, what is it, 60% of the books in the United States? It's at least 50%. And that is one company controlling discourse. And we can say the same thing about CNN, MSNBC, Fox, very, very small number. When I interviewed Bob McChesney back in the 90s, one of the things I quoted to him was a great Henry Adams quote, which is, "The press is the hired agent of a moneyed system set up for no other reason than to tell lies where the interests are concerned." And Henry Adams wrote that more than 100 years ago. And I said, well, look, so this has always been the case, right? And he said, yes, it is, that journalists have always been slanting stuff. The difference was back in 1900, you would have 12 newspapers in a city. You would have a socialist newspaper. You would have a Republican newspaper. You'd have a Democrat newspaper. And they're all spinning it. So you would actually have at least 12 versions of diversity, as opposed to now with You have what? Vice and Vogue. I don't even know the names of all these. Slate, all these, and they're putting out the same story. It's it's. Oh, I'm sure you've seen those videos of. I think these are usually put out by right wingers, but the left wingers can do it too. It doesn't matter. Um, you see videos of different newscasters telling a story, and it'll be like each newscaster does 2 words, and it's a coherent story because they're all telling the same story. So it'll do this newscaster saying, today there, next newscaster, wasn't exciting, next newscaster, thing happened in, next newscaster, Washington, D.C., as the next newscaster, brave and stunning. It's these things are dime a dozen, and it's because they're all telling the same story. It is this illusion of diversity. And I mean, how do we fight it? One of the ways we fight it is by, the classic line of speak out even though your voice shakes, and speak out. I mean, my entire career, my entire professional life has been based on screw it, I'm going to tell the truth no matter the consequences. And the truth as I understand it to be, and your truth is going to be different. And you know what should happen is you should speak out your truth, which disagrees with mine. And then somebody else can do their truth. And then people can read all 3 and they can make up their own minds. And they can read 50 more and they can make up their own minds.